Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation Disease Education webinar. Can I have the next slide? Today, we're going to talk about clinical trials and clinical research. This is a common question that we get very often about the availability of trials and whether a clinical trial and research study is right for me. On the next slide, I want to introduce Rex Edwards, who is the Vice President of our Care Center Network and Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation Patient Registry at the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation. Welcome, Rex.
Thank you, David.
And I'm Dave Lederer. I'm a pulmonologist and Senior Medical Advisor for the PFF. So Rex, I'm going to let you take it away. I want to make this medical disclaimer. We do not intend to provide you with any medical advice or medical recommendations. This is for informational purposes only. Please, if you do receive information from us over the course of this webinar that you think might apply to you, please discuss it with your healthcare provider before you make any changes to the medications you make or any other medical interventions that you require. All right, so now, Rex, I am going to turn it over to you, and I'm looking forward to hearing you talk all about clinical research.
All right, well, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who's joined this webinar. I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk with you. What I'm hoping to accomplish today is to discuss with you three broad topics, to emphasize the role and importance of clinical research, to discuss how to discover clinical research opportunities that you may want to consider participating in, and then if you choose to do so, what steps you should take from there and what you can expect. So to start, I want to talk just a little bit about generally what research is. And fundamentally, research is a systematic way for us to learn about the world. If it's well done, it follows what's called the scientific method, and that's sort of presented here in this circular diagram. And what this shows is that you start with a question that you want to answer, and you translate that into a hypothesis, which is really just a new form of the question that allows us to make a prediction. If we do X, we expect Y to happen. And through that, we can then test it. And so we design an experiment, we collect data, and we see if the data supports that hypothesis that we put forth. Does Y happen if we do X? And if that's true, then we're a step closer to answering an unknown question. And if it doesn't, then we go into the middle of the circle. We either refine that hypothesis or we reject it outright. We develop a new one, and we start a new experiment. We begin the cycle again. So this is how all research should be done to give us the most rigorous answers to the questions that we have. In a perfect world, everything about the experiment would be identical with the exception of the one thing we were testing. But that's very difficult to achieve under the best of circumstances, and very much so in the realm of clinical research. So when we talk about clinical research, we're talking about research done on human beings, and particularly those people who have a particular disease or condition. And there is a wide range of clinical research that is being done, and it helps us answer a lot of incredibly important questions. From the broad questions about who's getting a disease, what is causing it, how many people have it, that we learn from large epidemiological studies, to things about the genetics of individuals that may predispose them to get a disease or to progress differently than others, or importantly, to figure out what therapies may be most effective for them. Specifically, the idea of personalized medicine is becoming a very important topic. We know, particularly in the world of pulmonary fibrosis, that diagnosis is challenging, and so we want to learn better ways to make a diagnosis quickly and accurately. We want to understand how to improve the quality of life of those people living with the disease. Ideally, we want to get to a point where we can prevent anybody else from getting it. And until that happens, we want to learn how to treat it more effectively. Now, these treatment trials, typically called clinical trials, are probably the most familiar type of clinical research for people, but they're certainly not the only kind. And if you do decide to explore the possibilities of participation, I would encourage you to look beyond just the structured clinical trials for new drugs, for example, and see if there are opportunities that might help support efforts to answer some of these other important questions. So within the concept of clinical research, there are two very broad categories. there is observational research, which, as the name does imply, it doesn't involve giving anybody something new. It's really watching and learning about what's happening with them. And what this allows us to do is build large databases that researchers can come to try to answer some of those important questions. And they do it through that same methodology I described at the very beginning. It's not just that we collect all this information and we just look at it all and say, oh, something popped out, that must be the truth. It builds a tool for us to help rigorously answer those questions. So registries are one example of that type of observational research. The PFF patient registry that Dave mentioned is certainly one example of that. The other side, where a registry would collect, say, medical records or questionnaires that patients might fill out, there are also biomarker studies or biorepositories which do a similar thing, but they collect biological samples. So typically blood would be a common one. And they build these libraries, essentially, of blood samples from a lot of different people that allow us to start looking for things like genetics or genomic influences. But it also, very importantly, allows us to start looking for what's called a biomarker. And a biomarker is essentially it's a representation of the disease that's easy for us to measure. So the ideal biomarker, for example, in pulmonary fibrosis would be something in your blood that's easily looked for that would only be present if you had some degree of pulmonary fibrosis. And then in a truly perfect world, the amount of that, whatever was in your blood, would get higher the more severe your disease was. So it would be an ability not only to diagnose, but also to measure the progression of the disease much more easily than we can do so now. So these types of studies that are collecting samples are very important and certainly worth consideration. Another thing that a registry helps us do is more quickly identify those patients who might be eligible for what people most commonly think of, these traditional interventional studies. And this is where we give somebody a therapy and compare it to something else. And these are done much differently than observational studies. They usually require more active participation. There are certain visits that you have to attend, procedures that you go through, excuse me, also that they can collect the important data to find out if a therapy works. These are two sides of the clinical research coin. They're complementary. They answer different questions, but they're both very important. And one thing I want to mention here is that while if you were to participate in an interventional study of some sort, very likely they wouldn't want you to participate in another interventional study because that would confuse the results. But it's quite often the case that if you are participating in an interventional study, there might be observational opportunities that you would be eligible for as well. Again, the PFF patient registry, we have no restrictions. If you're in a clinical trial, you could still be in the registry. If you're already in the registry, it should not preclude you from being in the interventional study. So if you do choose to explore this, I would just say give some consideration to possibly maximizing the contributions you can make to see if there are things you can be in simultaneously. Okay. But the reality is, no matter what type of research you get focused on, there is a tremendously huge need for volunteers. Clinical research looks at human beings. We cannot do it without human volunteers. And at this moment, there are over 20,000 studies in the U.S. alone actively looking for volunteers. Now, that's across all diseases, so it's not specific to pulmonary fibrosis, but it gives you a sense of the magnitude of the problem. There are 56,000 studies worldwide looking for those volunteers. And this need is only going to grow. We have, as we get more companies and more researchers generating studies to answer more of these questions, there's more need for volunteers. And every time we discover a therapy, it raises the bar, because then we need to show that the next therapies are better than what we've had before. So as we raise the bar, that quite often requires more patients, and so it's expected that this need for patients is going to grow very rapidly in the near future. I recently saw a presentation that described people who volunteer for research studies as medical heroes. I don't think that is overstating it at all. So If there's anybody on this webinar who has participated in research or is currently participating in research, I want to thank you personally and on behalf of the research community for your contributions. There was a question that came in before the webinar about how many drug trials are there going on in IPF. So using a resource that we'll talk about a little bit more today, I was able to pull this list up of 33 studies that are identified as interventional studies in the interstitial lung disease realm. 3 of them are in development and will start enrolling soon. 30 of them are actively recruiting. And I think if you can see these numbers, you can get a sense of, one, the range of the number of patients required, anywhere from 7 patients for one trial to 600 for another. But it also helps give you an idea of the immediate magnitude of the need, because I won't make you do the math, but on this screen alone, that is almost 4,100 volunteers required just to support those studies. And again, those are just the interventional studies. That doesn't include the observational studies that still need volunteers. Beyond just the raw number of volunteers that are needed, there's the additional challenge of finding the right volunteers. So what you see on the screen here is called a recruitment funnel. And what the short version of what this tells us is to find 1 patient for a particular study, you need to go through 10 patients to find that one. So this describes kind of an overall across a lot of different diseases and a lot of different studies, kind of how that breaks out. You start with 100 patients, and immediately through what's called the pre-screening process, which is just a very high-level evaluation. Do the patients have the right disease? Are they the right gender? Are they the right age? Things that you can figure out without having to involve the patient. About 69% of people aren't going to meet it just right at that level. So you're left with 31 that you can approach and ask if they're interested. And one of the numbers that I'm hoping to affect here is that on average, 60% or so of patients refuse to participate for any number of reasons. So from 100, we're now down to 13 patients who have agreed to participate in a study, at which point they go through what's called the screening process. And screening is the opportunity for the researchers to evaluate a patient to determine if they meet the very specific entry requirements for the study. And about 1/3 of them do not. So quite often, if you are attempting to participate and for any reason find you're not eligible, it's during this phase, and it's usually going to be for a reason of safety, quite honestly. We'll talk more about that later. And then of the 9% of patients who make it to the point where they can start the trial, about 20% of them, for some reason or another, don't finish. So you can see that we have a number of challenges facing us to get clinical research trials fully enrolled. And whatever people's reasoning for participating or not, the research suggests that these are the important factors that influence that decision. And at the top of this list are the potential risks and benefits, and at the bottom, whether or not they would have access to the drug being studied when the study was over. And everything in between, all of this can be really broken into 3 broad categories. What are the risks to me? What do I have to do? And what do I get out of it? And so I'm going to try to touch on each of those a little bit as we go forward. And I'm going to start with the risks, because I think this is an area where many people may have some misconceptions or not be fully aware of just how much has been done to ensure people's safety within a clinical research environment. So all clinical research is built on, modern clinical research, I should say, is built on 3 fundamental principles that are on the screen here. Beneficence says that if we're going to do research on human beings, there should be some value at the end of that that makes it worth doing. And that whatever we're doing, whatever risks there are involved in that research, they should be kept to an absolute minimum. So we try to strike the appropriate balance between the benefits we can get out of it while keeping the risks as low as possible. Justice says that we're doing this for everyone. This is not for any select group of people. So the opportunities to participate should be available to everybody, and the benefits that we see from it should be shared with everybody. And respect for persons is a truly fundamentally important one, because history has examples where people have unfortunately had experiments done on them without their knowledge, and that is no longer acceptable in any sense. So the idea of being informed about what's happening to you. The idea of informed consent is absolutely essential. So we want to be sure that you get all the information we can possibly give you about the choice you're going to make so that you understand what's going to happen. And while everybody involved in clinical research tries to follow these principles as closely as possible, there are groups that are dedicated to doing nothing else except keeping an eye out for the welfare of participants. These groups are called institutional review boards, or IRBs. Every research center has at least one of them. Every clinical research project has to be reviewed by one. And these groups, they're groups made up of lots of different people, from specialists within the particular field to general doctors, ethicists, patients, all to give different perspectives to ensure that the benefits are there and the risks are minimum. These groups look over every aspect of the study before it started to ensure that it meets all of these essential principles. They look over any documents that a patient who's considering participation would see to ensure that it's honest and accurate, and that nothing in there promises things that can't be delivered or attempts to coerce somebody into doing something that's not in their best interest. So this is just one clear example of how dedicated the research community is to ensuring patient safety. These IRBs keep an eye on trials throughout their whole life. At least once a year they review it closely, and if there's anything that they find that makes them uncomfortable, they have great power to stop it or make changes to make sure that the welfare of the participants is protected. So clinical research happens in a lot of places. Not every doctor participates in clinical research, but many do. And some studies that you might look at happen at a single location, a single academic center or a doctor's office, and it's one investigator recruiting patients that he or she sees, and that is a lot of really great, excellent research. Sometimes, however, they need more patients than any one doctor can provide. And in that case, they do multi-center trials where a group of research centers get together and they all follow the exact same playbook, what they call the protocol, to ensure that everything is done consistently, that the data is all equal and can be combined in meaningful ways so that you can basically have a much larger study population than any one center could do. There is nothing about a single center versus a multiple center trial that indicates quality in any way. It's really just a matter of how many people are involved. So do not in any way consider that a single center trial is less valuable than a multi-center trial, because it's really a matter of what would be available close to you at that point. And every study will have a sponsor. So a sponsor is essentially whoever's paying for the work to be done. They have certain legal responsibilities, but that's the short version. And it could be an academic research center is sponsoring one of their investigators to do some work. It could be government funded, usually through the NIH or some other large organization. Nonprofit foundations like the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation. We are the sponsor of the patient registry. And obviously pharmaceutical companies play a large role in the clinical research world by running lots of different clinical trials. And I mention this just as you're evaluating studies because some people may have preferences about what types of research they participate in. It's a personal decision, but I just wanted to make sure everybody understands what the sponsor is. And then the other important thing to know about clinical research, particularly, well, specifically for interventional studies, is what phase of the trial, or what phase is the trial. So clinical trials progress through the phases here on the screen. Phase 1 is considered a first-in-man study. And this is going to be a relatively small trial, and I'll make some numbers up just to give you a sense of the size of these things. So assume a phase 1 trial might have about 10 patients in it. And this is going to be the first opportunity we have to study a drug in human beings. So before this happens, there's a lot of lab work that's done. There's a great deal of animal testing. So they're not going in cold. They understand a lot about the drug and how it works. But this is their first chance to see it actually work in a human being. So in this phase, they're going to be, making sure it's safe to give people. They want to understand how it moves through the human body, how is it processed, what's the right dosage to give. So phase 1s give us a lot of really fundamentally important information. And if it goes well, then they move to the phase 2 studies. So a 10-person phase 1 study would likely translate to about a 100-person phase 2 study. And at this point you're definitely going to be looking at patients with the disease, and they're going to start looking to see if the drug does what they hope it's going to do, whether it's reverse fibrosis or slow its progression, whatever their target is, they're starting to look at the effectiveness at that. But in the phase 2 arena, they're really heavily focused on ensuring safety. And so while they will look at both of these things and they will do measurements to look at effectiveness or efficacy, there is a heavy focus on the safety side of things to ensure that this is something we really want to move forward with. And if that all goes well, that 100-patient phase 2 trial may evolve into a 1,000-patient phase 3 study. So it just gives you a sense of how quickly these things grow. And the phase 3 studies are the ones that will ultimately determine whether the FDA chooses to approve this drug or not. So they're at this point really focusing in on that effectiveness side of things to be sure it does what they hoped it would do to a degree that makes it worth selling to people. But they're never taking their eye off safety. So if you're in a phase 3 trial, you're still going to have a great deal of safety monitoring going on, because you cannot evaluate the benefit of a drug without understanding the risks of it. And every drug comes with some amount of risk. So through the phase 3 process, they build the data, hopefully to convince the FDA that this is a drug that the people should be allowed to purchase if it's good for them, if it's good for their particular diagnosis. And then once that happens, phase 4 trials are triggered. Quite often phase 4 trials are going to be long-term safety studies, because no matter how thorough anybody is at measuring the safety during a clinical trial, people are in it for a fairly short amount of time. And there's no way to really understand what the long-term effects of taking this therapy might be. So phase 4 studies are intended to allow us to see that longer horizon and understand if there are any concerns about safety that we couldn't have picked up during the trial. But equally important, particularly if you're looking for participation, is that phase 4 trials could also be a drug that was approved for a specific disease, say one of the 2 approved agents for IPF, idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. Phase 4 studies may be looking at that same drug, but in a different disease where they think it might have some impact. So phase 4 studies are another important way to find more uses for therapies that have been proven effective in some other disease state. Okay, and now I want to just switch to talk about a few terms that will be important as you look at clinical research. And to do that, I want to start by saying bias is bad, particularly in the realm of research. As I mentioned, the perfect experiment keeps everything else identical, and the only thing that's changing is the thing we're testing. Human beings are much more complicated than that, and we uniquely carry with us preconceptions about things that can affect our behavior. So if you have made up your mind that something is not good for you, and you find out that you're taking that something, it is going to affect how you respond to that or whether you choose to continue to take it. So there are many strategies that are employed in clinical research to try to minimize that bias and the effect it could have on research results. So one of those is the idea of randomization. And this is so commonly used now that during that recruitment funnel, that's sort of the shorthand for you've been allowed to start a trial. You've been randomized. Because what that says is that if you're going to be in a trial that's comparing therapy A to therapy B, whichever one you're assigned to is a matter of chance. It's a flip of a coin or the roll of the dice. And it removes the possibility that for some reason, perhaps an investigator gives all the healthiest patients treatment A and all the sickest patients treatment B, and it makes it impossible to make fair comparisons. So randomization does a number of important things to reduce the possibility of that sort of biased approach. Another one is the idea of blinding. So in an unblinded trial or an open label trial, whatever therapy you're assigned to, you would immediately know what it is. We're studying Tylenol versus aspirin. You get a bottle and it either says Tylenol or aspirin on it. And again, that provides the opportunity, if you have some preconceptions about the effectiveness of aspirin, say, it might affect how you behave in the trial. So a lot of times they try to avoid that by instituting blinding or masking, which is essentially hiding the treatment that you're on from you. And in a single blinded trial, you as the research participant are the one who doesn't know what you're getting. But the doctor, the research doctor giving it to you does know. So this would be something like a Pepsi challenge. You show up, there's some guy standing behind a table with 2 cups of soda labeled A and B, one's Pepsi, one's Coke. You don't know which one is which, you're giving your honest opinion, but the guy behind the table could very well decide he wants Pepsi to win, so he could do things like put the Pepsi a little closer to you, or make sure it's colder than the Coke to influence the results. And because we don't want that, the minimum gold standard for a randomized trial is what's called a double blind. And in that case, neither you, the participant, nor the doctor giving it to you know what the treatment is. So it avoids the possibility of that bias. And then triple and quadruple blinding is really just an extension of that same idea, in which the people behind the scenes who are analyzing the data of a trial also don't know which therapy is which. Triple and quadruple blinding will have very little real influence on or impact on your participation in a trial, but you may see the terms occasionally, so I wanted to be clear. And part and parcel with blinding is the idea of a placebo. So a placebo is an inactive substance that has no impact on your body, often called a sugar pill. And it's there to allow studies to be done in which we want to test a therapy against nothing at all. So it's very difficult to get people excited about taking nothing at all. So placebos exist to hide the fact that they're getting nothing, or to make it uncertain to them whether they're getting the active treatment or not. So they make up a placebo that looks, tastes, smells, and feels just like the active therapy, so that when you get assigned a bottle of something, you don't know whether it's the real thing or the placebo. So these are all important terms that may come up as you research clinical research opportunities. And then I want to talk just a little bit about the idea of who can get in. So as I mentioned, every clinical research project, observational or interventional, has some entry criteria. These are usually shorthand version called the inclusion-exclusion. And the inclusions are the ones that describe the population they're looking to enroll. We want patients with IPF who are between the ages of 50 and 80, who have a forced vital capacity in this range. And then the exclusions say, except in these conditions. So most of the exclusions that you'll see are going to be there for safety. If you've recently had a heart attack and you're just generally not healthy enough to participate, that would be an exclusion. If you are on a medication that has the possibility of an interaction with what they're testing, that would be an exclusion. If you are allergic to something in the medication, those sorts of things. So there are some other reasons why they might have exclusions, but again, primarily to ensure the safety of research participants. So all that said, let's assume that you decided you want to participate in clinical research. What do you do next? Well, our first suggestion is always to contact the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation. We are here to help. You can either check out our website at pulmonaryfibrosis.org, or you can contact our Patient Communications Center at 844-TALK-PFF, or email them at pcc@pulmonaryfibrosis.org. And while we can't give you any specific medical advice, as was discussed at the very beginning, we can try to help guide you to opportunities that are convenient for you that may best suit your needs. We are working to expand our offerings as far as helping guide patients. So if at any point during your journey you find that there are certain things that would be really helpful for us to provide to others who are looking, please feel free to let us know. Probably through the PCC would be the easiest way to do that. Another really important approach is to talk with your doctor. As I mentioned, not all doctors participate in clinical research, but if they don't personally get involved, they should be able to refer you to somebody who does. And if you're being seen at any point at any of our care centers, I can promise you that they are all heavily involved in research. So they have many clinical research opportunities, and hopefully they can find one that is right for you. And then the other option that I want to demonstrate for you today is to utilize the NIH website called clinicaltrials.gov. And this is a website that has been around for a while, but it's recently gotten a lot more traction. Researchers who are doing projects are essentially required by law to put their projects into this database. And so it is a tremendous resource for seeing what is out there. That information that I showed about the number of interventional studies going on was data pulled right out of this absolutely free website. So what I'm going to do is switch over to that quickly and just walk through it with you a little bit to give you some ideas about how to use it and what you'll understand, what you'll get out of it. So as you can see here, they have over 250,000 research studies in here, and that includes those that are ongoing as well as those that have been completed. But the starting point is this little search feature here. So you start out by figuring out what condition you're interested in. Now, the one thing I do have to make everybody aware of is that this is an incredibly good resource, but the information is provided and managed by human beings who are fallible and overworked sometimes, so it's possible for the data to be inconsistent or incomplete. So depending on how people choose to tag certain studies, certain search fields won't include them. So there is a lot of flexibility in this search feature that I'm just going to demonstrate to give kind of an idea. So you could do a simple pulmonary fibrosis search, and that would give you one set of research opportunities. But so not everybody calls it pulmonary fibrosis. So in those cases, I started with ILD. If you use capital letters for these, you can use or and. So I can call it interstitial lung disease or pulmonary fibrosis. And simply because it happens to come up a lot, it seems to be a heavy correlation, but it does tend to confuse things, I want to exclude cystic fibrosis. So you can use the word not to exclude those things that you just realize aren't relevant. So this gives you a great deal of flexibility in what you can look for. And then I will limit our search just to the United States because I think that's probably what's most relevant. And then if you're personally looking for something close to you, you can specify which state you're in and only see those things that are recruiting close to you. But for now, we'll look at the whole country. If you say search all studies, that's going to give you everything, including those things that have been completed. But if you say find a study to participate in, then you will get only those trials that are currently recruiting or are about to be recruiting. So you can see with that search and those particular terms, there are 6 studies currently going on in the interstitial lung disease / pulmonary fibrosis realm. And as we go down here, and I know I'm guessing that this is probably coming through fairly tiny on the screen, and I apologize for that. But if you see over here on the left of the screen, this is where you can select the types of studies that you would be shown. Here you can start getting information about you to see if you meet that kind of broad pre-screening qualification for a study. So you may be able to winnow away some things that just wouldn't be applicable to you. You can look here at the study type and choose between the interventional studies we talked about versus the observational. Study results are those that have been completed, so not particularly relevant for this search. You can limit it to a particular phase or certain phases of studies that you might be interested in participating in. And then you can choose the type of sponsor that you're interested in participating in their studies. Again, some people have certain preferences. This allows you to apply those preferences as you see fit. For the purposes of our discussion, I'm going to ignore all of that and just look at the listing that we got here, which is, I've got it set to show 50 studies, so it gives us some stuff to look at. And at this very first screen, you can very quickly get some general information. You can see the study title, which might tell you a little bit about what the study is. You can see the conditions that they're looking for, and you can see how much variation there can be in that. They've got one listed as pulmonary fibrosis, some interstitial lung disease. So that can immediately start telling you whether or not you're likely to be qualified for that study. And then in the interventions column, that kind of gives you an immediate sense of whether this is likely to be an observational study or an interventional study. And if it is an interventional study, what are they looking at? You know, is it this procedure here where they're looking at cell therapy, or is it a standard drug trial where they're looking at pirfenidone versus placebo? So this is a nice quick overview of what's going on in the world, but it's not necessarily all the detail that you might want to have. So just because I looked at it recently, I'm going to pick this one here of Tiplicast versus placebo. So if you click on the name of the study, you'll be taken to yet another screen which provides a great deal of detail about that particular study. So you've got the name here, and then as you go down here, you get the purpose. Now, if it's well done, this purpose can tell you a great deal about what this study is. You can see, if you guys can read this, and I hope that you can, it starts out, this is a randomized, placebo-controlled, double-blind, 6-month study. So since we've talked about those terms, right there you have a pretty good understanding of the large overview of what this study is, and now you know how long it goes on for. It's a 6-month study. But it's followed by a 6-month open label period. So for the first 6 months, you won't know what you're getting. You'll be doing that for 6 months. And then 6 months beyond that, you will be definitely getting whatever it is they're testing. So the open label periods have a lot of research value, but they also do ensure that if you're participating, that you know you're going to eventually get access to whatever is being tested. Whereas in a placebo-controlled trial, you may just be getting placebo and that's all you ever get. So a lot of people are very pleased about the access to an open label period. As you read further, it'll tell you how many patients are going to be enrolled, which is 15, and then it gives you a lot more details. I won't go through it all. I will just want to give you kind of an overview. So here, as you go down, study type interventional, we've discussed that. Here you see masking. They've got it listed as quadruple, even though they called it a double-blind study. Again, that is anything above double-blind or higher, wouldn't worry about it. It's a very solid approach. And then even further down, you can see the outcome measures. And the outcome measures are those things that they are trying to understand to see if the treatment that they're studying works. So the primary outcome is that thing that they've said is the most important thing that they want to see. So here it says they're going to measure the change in your forced vital capacity for that first 6 months that you're on either the drug or placebo. And then the secondary outcome measures are those things that they're measuring because it's going to take a lot of people's time and money to do this trial. Why not understand as much about it as they can? So they very often measure lots of other things as well. Now the primary outcome measure will be what they hang their hat on, but those secondary measures are also incredibly important. And by reading through it, you can start getting a sense of how much work is going to be involved, what procedures are likely to be done, what questionnaires they're going to be asking you to fill out. It's not the same as getting a full description of the study, but it starts to give you a little bit of a handle on what's happening. And then finally, and just a little further down here, you start to see this list of inclusions and exclusions. And again, I don't know how well you guys can read this, but inclusions, all genders, ages 21 to 80. They have to have IPF. They describe the severity of the disease they're looking for, and they define how they define that. And then a few other things. And then the exclusion criteria, again, tend to be these safety-oriented things. Clinically significant cardiovascular disease. You've had a recent heart attack. You've got immune system disease. This is a statement you'll almost always see. Any significant laboratory abnormality which, in the opinion of the investigator, may put the subject at risk. So that means that even if everything else falls into place, if you don't hit any specific exclusion criterion, your doctor can say, I just don't think this is safe for you, and he can keep you out for that reason. This is so important that this shows up again here on another list, a list of clinically significant medical conditions that would pose a risk to the subject. So again, I just want to emphasize how much work is put into maintaining the safety of research participants. And then very importantly down here are the contacts. So I would always encourage you, as you look through this one here, we can see that they say that the locations where this is happening is at Penn State University, and that's the only place that's listed. That may be the case. This may be happening only at Penn State, but it's possible that somebody just didn't get around to putting all the other locations onto the website. So I would encourage you, if you do come across a trial or a study that looks interesting to you, go ahead and reach out to the people listed under contacts to confirm where that's happening, because they may say, oh, you know what, we actually do have one 20 miles from you, we just didn't put it on the website. Or they may be able to tell you that we're opening new sites and you should be able to enroll in several months, something like that. So if there's something that looks appealing, do not be discouraged if you don't see a listing close to your home until you check, just because people make mistakes and things sometimes don't happen. So that's a quick overview of this tool, which again I think is an excellent starting point to allow you to start examining what the opportunities are that you may be wanting to participate in. And I'm going to switch now back to our regularly scheduled slideshow. So you found a research opportunity that looks interesting. You've contacted the group there and they say, yes, we have positions open and we have one reasonably close to you. Would you like to come talk to us? So you make a trip to whatever the center is that's doing it. And what will happen is you will meet with the research team and you'll be given what's called an informed consent form, or an ICF. And this is a critical document that describes lots of important facts about this. What are the risks of the study? What are the benefits? Why are we doing it? What will it cost you? All of these important things. And it's intended to be written at a very easy to read level, but they're also quite long. So they can be 12 or 15 pages long, and many people do not read them as thoroughly as they probably should. So it's important to remember that just getting an ICF form is not enough. You should be given an opportunity to talk to the researchers about this and get your questions answered. And when you have that opportunity, I encourage everyone very strongly to use it, because this is just a fantastic chance for you to really understand what you are signing up for. And there are a list of questions that they recommend you ask. I'll run through them. Some of them I think more important than others. But what are the possible benefits and risks of participation? And I think certainly the risks is a critical thing to fully understand. The benefits, quite often in a clinical research study, you'll be told something to the effect of, there is no expectation of direct benefit to you. Because the reality of clinical research timelines is that they often take so long before they produce an actual treatment that most people do not go into clinical research with the idea that they're directly going to create something that may be for them. They're doing it altruistically for future generations, for family members, for others, to ensure that they don't have to struggle with this disease. But that's not to say there aren't some immediate benefits. I mean, especially if you're in a regimented treatment trial where you're coming back to see a doctor every 8 to 12 weeks, you're getting a lot of very high quality medical attention for low or no cost. You may get access to that experimental therapy that may have benefits for you. So it's not to say that there isn't the chance of some immediate benefit for you, but that's really not the overall intention of participation in clinical research. It's to make the future brighter for others. What are the study requirements? I think this one is one that could be far too easily glossed over. You need to fully understand what is going to be expected of you. How often do you have to come back? What procedures will you undergo while you're there? Is there stuff you have to do at home? Are there changes to your lifestyle that you need to be aware of? Really appreciate what the commitment is that you're making. You may want to know more about how many other people are participating. You may want to understand more about why they think this is an important question to answer. You definitely want to understand if there's any financial impact. Most research studies are designed, hopefully, so that it costs you nothing. The procedures and all the tests and measurements and the care that you get should be covered by the cost of the research study. But there are cases where they may apply or may submit charges to your insurance company. So you need to understand if you're responsible for co-pays or how that would be handled. So that's an important discussion to have and learn if there's any compensation to cover travel costs or things like that. And in the unlikely event that something does go wrong, Again, every procedure has risks. If something were to go wrong, who's going to take care of you? How is that going to be managed is an important thing to understand. And these things are true of any type of clinical research study. And if you're doing specifically a drug trial, you may want to know more about what is the evidence to suggest that this drug is useful? Why are you pushing forward with this? And they can help you understand that. Are there possible contraindications, which means are there certain drugs that you should not be taking while you're on this medication? And it's really important to be as thorough and honest with your medications as you possibly can when you go into this, because the dangers of drug-drug interactions are not to be taken lightly. So your research team needs to be fully aware of what you're currently on, and you need to understand those medications you need to stay away from during the course of the trial. And then again, sometimes if things are looking good in the trial, they may allow people who participated in the study access to that experimental medication before it gets onto the market. And so you can ask if that is an option for you. And then, as I mentioned at the very beginning, you may also want to ask, is it possible for me to participate in some other, maybe an observational? Can I also be in this registry? Or can I donate blood to this biobank? Which is, again, hugely important, building a hugely important resource for future research, and hopefully can be done without adding any burden to you. So I'm going to wrap up now just with the kind of hit the takeaways, and I hope everybody has heard today. Cannot understate how huge the need is for volunteers. It's just, I'm becoming a little passionate about it, so if I've said this too much, I apologize. But there are so many important clinical research programs going on, each and every one of them dependent on people like you who can help contribute their time and their energy and their bodies to helping us understand things. The research participants' protection, not only of their physical safety, but their privacy, is absolutely paramount. There are so many systems in place to ensure that you're kept anonymous, that your data is secure, and that you are taken care of with the absolute highest quality. And then there's always a large group of people specifically watching out to make sure that that happens. And there are a lot of reasons why you might not qualify for any individual trial, but there is so much variety in the different clinical research opportunities out there that keep looking, and you will very likely find something that's be a good fit for you that will allow you to contribute something to the search for a cure. And finally, the participation in this is always your choice. It's your choice if you start. It's your choice if you continue. At any point, you can say, I don't want to do this anymore. So it's really important that you have these discussions with both your doctors, the research team, and your family, your caregivers, and your loved ones, because there may be things that impact them as well, be it additional visits to the hospital or any other things like that. So as much as we want people to participate in clinical research, we want the people who participate in clinical research to have a satisfying experience with it. And so the more discussion you can have beforehand to ensure that everybody's comfortable with it, the better your experience is likely to be. And with that, I'm going to wrap up. I thank you all very much for your attention, and I will hand it back over to Dr. Lederer to take us home.
All right, Rex, thank you. That was spectacular, and did a really, really great job. I do want to give a little plug for the Pulmonary Fibrosis Foundation Summit, which is coming up in November. It will take place in Nashville at the Omni Nashville Hotel. There is still time to register, and we'd encourage you to go to our website, learn more about it. It's pffsummit.org. And always you can reach out to the Patient Communication Center at PFF if you have questions about it, but we hope to see you there. And then I just want to thank everyone. I want to thank Rex. You did a wonderful job, and I thank you for taking a full hour out of your day to do this. I want to thank all of our listeners. I want to thank Lori and other staff at the PFF who have helped put all of this together. And I also want to acknowledge our sponsors, Boehringer Ingelheim and Genentech, who have made this possible. All right, thank you, and please keep a lookout for emails where we'll advertise our next webinar. Bye-bye.